Let's talk about power supplies.
Oh, yeah. You gotta get sweaty. You gotta get sweaty in here. It's time to get sweaty.
TeknoAXE introduces the new E900 Plus environment noise canceling headphones. Incorporating TeknoAXE's visionary digital 7.1 surround sound, the E900 Plus sports their newly designed 50mm speakers, which kick out a kick-ass dynamic range with an earth-shaking low end. Priced at only $43.99, the E900 Plus clinches the trifecta of weight, sound, and price to kick the competition in the daddy bags. Click the link below and use the code HMODS to get 10% off when you order direct from TeknoAXE.net.
What's up, everyone? I'm Hobbs and you're watching HMODS. I like computers. You like computers, presumably. I mean, you wouldn't be watching this for any other reason. Anyway, so let's just go right into what these are. If you built a computer, you know what this is. This is your power supply. In layman's terms, this is your power supply. This is where you... This is basically, to use a car analogy, this is your engine. And not the gasoline is the electricity. That's kind of a stupid thing. Let's just move right past this. In today's PC building economy, things have gotten really fucking whacked. We have miners fucking up the game. We have scalpers fucking up the game. We have MSI fucking up its own game. We have NZXT also fucking up their own game. Because you have people that are scalping products, you have miners that are just ruining the whole economy of the system of PC building, most notably with like graphics cards, things like that. But you've also got companies that are basically just using subpar products. And so while we're not going to talk too much about that today, we are going to talk about one important issue with building your PC, and that is, how much power do you actually need? And the answer to that is not as much as you think. If you live in North America, your house runs on 110 volts at 15 to 30 amps. Now, we're not going to talk about the amps, but the amps are something you don't want to f with. But what we're talking about here is your power supply is basically, it's not just supplying power to the computer, because your wall could do that. What this does is it has a process called rectification. They change from alternate current to direct current. That's AC/DC. An interesting thing about power supplies is there's a lot of different kinds. And a lot of them will correspond to what is now called the 80 plus standard. The 80 plus standard was started in 2004, sort of a voluntary system of measurement. Basically, it is the standard at which your power supply will be operating at 80% efficiency. And by today's standards, that's actually kind of low, because 80 plus is pretty much the minimum that any power supply will run at, because the parts are better. You know, technology has advanced to the point where the electricity is pretty freaking efficient, no matter where you are in the world. However, there are brands that shortcut it, and so let's just go with the pieces of shit. We'll start with pieces of shit. This is a piece of shit. This is the piece of shit power supply that I took out of Project Tango back when it was a piece of shit. It's an ASA 750 watt alpha power supply. Now, by the 80 plus standard, this does not measure. This is because it's a Chinese company that didn't bother to really put in the work. What's also an issue with this is it really used subpar parts. It's because this power supply failed that Project Tango came to me in the first place. When I propped this open, two of the capacitors had blown, which means the power supply took a power surge and didn't shut down. It passed right through the caps into the motherboard, which is why 3 capacitors on the motherboard were blown. The CPU was f***ed, the CPU cooler was f***ed, and it wouldn't do anything. It wouldn't do shit. So that's right there. The 80 plus standard system, there's several different tiers. One of them, we'll just start with there's bronze, there's silver, there's gold, there's platinum, and then there's titanium. Titanium is the top, bronze is the bottom. Now, bronze is not necessarily bad. Bronze is just basically your Honda Civic of 80 plus standard power supplies. Now, all of these are, they're except for this one, which is a piece of shit. All of these are good power supplies. This is a gold, this is a platinum, this is titanium, these are gold too. This is not, this is a piece of shit. This doesn't even have an 80 plus standard measurement on it. So we're just gonna count that as a DNF, did not finish, because that thing is, it's like bringing a knife to a gunfight. So with that established, we've now established that the 80 plus standard is basically a unit of measurement for how efficient your power supply is going to be operating at a certain capacity. Then it comes to power draw versus max capacity. And for this, it's a little bit different because I like to get more power than I need. And the reason is this. Let's go back to the car analogy. If you're in a drag race, do you want the Honda Civic or do you want the really, really fast car? And it's kind of like that. You can get up to, you've got a souped up Honda Civic. Stupid Honda Civic, 3rd generation Honda Civic with the stupid rear spoiler on there, like, you know, a 15-pound turbo intercooler on there going in a straight line. This is why I drive a Mazda speed, because my car was not built to go in a straight line. It's built to take turns at 40 miles an hour. Like there's this freeway exit about 5 miles that way. It's a loop exit, and I can take that exit at 50 miles an hour. That's what my car was built for. Honda Civics are f***ing stupid. I don't understand why people will take. So you've got your Honda Civic of power supplies, and let's not the Bugatti Chiron. We'll say this is the Jaguar XJS. And in a drag race, both of these cars will reach 100 miles an hour. But this one will do it in its sleep because it's got so much more power to play with on a moment's notice versus this one, which is going to be like the little engine that could just. And this one's just going to be like. These will both supply your computer with power, but this one will do it more efficiently because 1, it's got better equipment, and 2, it's got a whole lot more overhead to play with. And that's the whole idea of power draw. If you've got 2 systems, same specs, these power supplies in each of them. This one, the one that this one is in, is going to run a bit more efficiently. 1, because it's not using as much of its power to give said power to the computer, and so you're basically just going to be running a more efficient system. Versus this one, which will run, but if you have any hope to upgrade, this will kind of. You'll eventually need to upgrade this one. The reason why I had this one in the first place was because it was in Blandolf. Blandolf, as you've seen, has a GTX 750 GTI. I don't like golfs either. It has a GTX 750 SC and, you know, a little mini ITX motherboard, and it doesn't really need to be much more than it is. All I do is watch movies on it, and that's it. However, if I did want to upgrade the GPU or anything like that, and pretty much anything, if I wanted to upgrade anything in that computer, I was going to need a power supply. So, in the concept of that, I switched it out for a 750 watt. Another thing to consider with dealing with power supplies is your temperature, because again, when you have two different PCs, same spec, same build, and you're using these kinds of power supplies, this one is also going to run much cooler, which is a huge contributor to efficiency, because as I've said many times, heat is your worst enemy with a gaming computer. Let's get on to the different power supplies. As you can see, there's a lot of different configs here. This is your sort of stock run-of-the-mill power supply that you'll get from pre-built at the store. This is what we call the ketchup and mustard cables. These different colored cables, of course, do have their reasons, but they are a little bit different than you would expect, because a lot of people will say, oh, red is power and black is ground. Not true in this one. You've got your red cable, which is your 5 volts. You've got your yellow cable, which is the 12 volt. That's all the power that's coming from the power supply. You've got your orange cable, which is 3 volts, and then you do have black, which is ground. So, like I said, these are the ketchup and mustard cables. And once you actually learn what all this stuff is, what all the different cables are for, you could actually easily make your own cables. But we're not going to talk about that today. We'll talk about that another time. So this is what we call a non-modular power supply, because it has everything you're going to need, and then that's just it. You don't really have a choice in the say. You just get all the cables you're going to need. And generally, these are stuff that you'll easily switch out. Next, you've got your semi-modular power supply. This is the power supply that has just what you need and nothing that you don't. It'll come with what's called your EPS cable and your motherboard cable installed. And then you'll have your choice of SATA cable, ports, and your PCIe. As you can see, this thing only has one PCIe cable pinout, and then the rest are peripheral and SATA. So you're not going to get a whole lot of bells and whistles on this, but this is for people that don't need it. These are what you call modular power supply, fully modular power supplies. And these are the ones for the big boys, because as you'll see, it's basically it doesn't have any cables installed, and it has a much better system of pinouts, because where this is basically you'll have this is all the length you're going to get, and you better work with it. These open yourself up to custom cables. Basically what you're seeing here is a much more versatile power supply. Same thing with this, same thing with this, same thing with this. The cables these things come with, unfortunately, there's the hiccup. Because while this and this can use the same pinouts, because Asetek and Seasonic and Asus and EVGA and maybe Power Color will use the same pinouts for their power supply, companies like Corsair and XFX do not. And this is good business. Unfortunately, these companies have caught on to the fact that if they make their power supplies so that only their cables will be able to be usable, you have to buy their cables. Or if you're buying from companies like Cable Mod or Mod Guru, those companies have to make those cables for those power supplies. The upshot to this, though, is that when you have fully modular power supplies, you're going to have a whole lot more versatility to your system, and generally better cables, better stock cables that just come with it. These aren't bad, but as you can see, they're kind of thin, versus if you're getting a custom cable system for these things, you're going to have bigger wires, which means it'll handle the temperatures a bit better, and again, you're going to have a much more efficient system. So let's talk about power consumption. In my rig, I have an Intel i5-8600K, an 8GB RX 580. Don't judge, because let me guess, you don't have a 3090 either. So I've got an RX 580 8GB, I've got 32 gigabytes of XPG RAM, one SSD, and 2 hard drives. And if you go on Newegg, that's a total of 528 watt draw. Here's the thing. When you get a computer part and it says such and such watts, that's the max. It doesn't generally need that to run. Because, and let's take it back to the car analogy. My car has 300 horsepower. It basically came like that. But I don't use it all the time because, you know, even though my car is a turbo, sometimes I'm just driving on the street and I'm doing 40 miles an hour and it's using a fraction of that. It's very much the same system with a computer, because when you have any kind of power supply in it, it's supplying the necessary power, but it's not supplying the maximum power at all times. This is why if you have this in one system and this in one system, both of these can run quite efficiently if you're not doing any overclocking or doing any heavy lifting. With my system rated at 528 watts max, I could have gotten away with a 550 watt power supply. But let's just say you have a load of money these days, even though you probably don't. Let's just say you've got a nice new rig, 5950X, 6800 XT, 16 gigabytes of RAM, one SSD. You're gonna be running about 540 watts. And that's just like, it doesn't necessarily mean, you don't need a whole lot. And if you're running dual, you're only gonna be needing about 900. Versus if you're running the same spec with a 3080, it is a little bit more, but you'll notice it's not a huge difference. Now let's move over to the Intel. You've got a 10900KF, 6800 XT, 16 gigabytes of RAM, one SSD. Again, it's not much of a difference. You're gonna be running about 560 watts. And if you're running dual, it's a little over 900 watts. And same thing with the 3080. If you look at it, it's just, there's not that much of a difference. So think about that when you're buying your power supply. So here it is. The long and short of it is this. If you're going to buy a power supply, do yourself a favor and buy one that suits your needs. Because as I've always said, if you don't need it, don't spend your money. Like putting a rear wing on a Honda Civic. You don't fucking need it and you look. But if I had to guess, you're a little bit like me and you're gonna get a gold power supply. If I'm giving you any advice, get a bigger power supply than you need. Get it about twice the power rating that you're gonna need. If you go on Newegg, there's a really, really easy power calculator, and it'll tell you how much power you need. Not what you're gonna use, but need. And so try and get something a third more to twice the power you're going to need, because then you're just, one, you're not gonna have any upgrade problems, and two, you're gonna be running a much more efficient system. Like I said, it's not that difficult a thing. The only things you need to consider are price and quality, and where you want those two to meet. So if you want a really, really kick-ass system, go with the Jaguar. If you want a system you can afford, go with the Honda Civic. You're gonna be able to run your computer on both these systems. It's just this one's gonna be a little bit more efficient. That's all it is. Because it's not gonna be using all of its power. There you go.